It's great to welcome to the program today Bill Browder, who is the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management, head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, and also author of the book Red Notice. So, Bill, to start with, the story you tell in your book includes, as you got into the world of finance, your interest in Eastern Europe, which included initially doing some work in Poland when there was relatively little work being done in Poland by US and British-based folks in the finance world, and eventually actually going to Russia itself. Talk a little bit about how that all worked and how you ended up working in that part of the world.
Sure. So I went out to Russia in 1992, just at the beginning of the Russian privatization program. Basically, when the Soviet Union broke up, Russia became a sort of quote democracy. The new president wanted to go from communism to capitalism, and in order to do that, they basically the state owned all the property, and they said we're going to give all the property away for free to the people and make them capitalists. And and of course, as we know, most of the property ended up in the hands of a very small number of Russian oligarchs. But there were little crumbs falling off the table, and those crumbs were shares of some of the biggest Russian companies which were trading on the stock market. And I went and set up a business called the Hermitage Fund to basically pick up those crumbs and invest in the newly privatized companies. And for a while, it was just a bonanza, like bigger profits, I guess, made cryptocurrency gains, look like child's play. It was just so, the returns were so great.
So you eventually got involved in this space where there was the possibility of investing in Russian companies at massive discounts from what traditional finance measures would assess as the value of these companies. Talk a little bit about how that worked, how you got into that.
Well, so the situation was that nobody really understood what was there. It was sort of a state secret. The oil industry was a state secret. All these big companies were not known to the Russians, and the Russians had these vouchers. They called them privatization certificates, and they could invest their vouchers in whatever they wanted to invest them in, or sell their vouchers. And most Russians didn't really think that their vouchers would be worth anything, and so they sold them for a bottle of vodka. And various people were buying up vouchers, and this voucher exchanges formed. And I did the math, and I said, okay, if you buy shares in some of these oil companies, you're buying oil at like 10 cents per barrel of oil reserves in the ground. And at the time, oil prices were, let's say, trading at $30. And so 10 cents in the ground versus $30 out of the ground, that kind of had to be a good deal. And so, but to tell you the truth, it was really hard to get people interested in the West in that. I would say, look, here, these things are trading at a 99.9% discount. And most people, when they heard the word Russia, they ran for the hills. And so it wasn't like this was something that was like a slam dunk, obvious to most people. Most people said, well, whatever the valuations are, I don't want to go anywhere near Russia.
So ultimately, you fell out of favor in Russia, and ultimately were even expelled from the country, legal problems. What went wrong? How did the problem start to develop?
Well, so the companies that I ended up becoming the largest foreign investor in Russia. We had $4.5 billion invested in all these companies. And what I discovered was all the companies were basically being robbed blind by these oligarchs who were the majority shareholders. And so I decided to try to start fighting the thievery, the robbing of these companies by exposing it. And in doing so, in these dictatorships and third world countries, business and politics are all sort of intertwined. And so the moment that I started exposing all these nasty things going on, all of a sudden the politics got involved, and I was expelled from the country. I was declared a threat to national security. My offices were raided. They seized all of our documents. And the next thing we knew, those documents were used to perpetrate a a highly complex fraud where they then stole our companies and used those companies to steal $230 million of taxes that my company had paid to the Russian government. And so it was all politics mixed with business, mixed with criminality. And I was on the receiving end of all of that stuff.
Right. So people may or may not know, but Russia is a huge country. It has extremely rural areas, and those rural areas have courts. And often those courts are operating under the direction of who knows who in power, bribes, corruption, etc. Talk a little bit about how that all worked. I mean, that was really the basis for how these assets and companies were taken from you.
Yeah, so Russia's a very formalistic place. So it's not like they in like, I don't know, in Mexico or I don't know where, they just grab your stuff and that's done. In Russia, everything is sort of done with some kind of pretense, and so they'll go to the court, and the court the judge will make a decision to transfer your assets to somebody else, and he'll stamp the judgment, and so they love all this sort of procedural bureaucratic stuff, even though you can just unwind it and show that it's all been done fraudulently. For some reason, that doesn't, even if you can show it's done fraudulently, that doesn't bother them. They can all just wave their court decisions in the air based on a, $500 bribe they made to the judge. And that's the order of magnitude of bribes that they probably had to make in order to get these kinds of decisions through the courts.
So you tell one story, and the way I like to sort of, when I read a nonfiction book about something I'm not already familiar with, I first don't look up anything about it. I just read the book. And then I'll look up, well, what are the other perspectives about it? And after reading your book and hearing your story, doing some research as well for this interview, I come across allegations that you were not actually the victim, but you actually were the perpetrator. In other words, you used the systems that you criticize and say that victimized you to actually participate in the corruption and in the fraud. Now, it's beyond my ability to adjudicate these things independently in the context of this interview. You tell one story, there are others who tell another story. But what do you make of the fact that there are these counter allegations that have been made that say you are actually the perpetrator here and not the victim?
Well, first of all, those allegations were made by the people who stole the money. So, so we have just so you know, in Russia, this is what they do. They shoot down a plane going over Russia, and they blame it on the people who were on the plane. Everything is the other guys did it. And in our case, the whole thing is sort of completely absurd from top to bottom. The money was stolen so our companies were stolen, and all of these sort of machinations were done in December, like October, December of 2007, and we filed a criminal complaint with all the major Russian law enforcement agencies after we learned about the theft of our companies, and we put that onto the record. And 3 weeks after we filed our complaint, the tax money was stolen, the $230 million of taxes that we paid. And so what criminals would file a complaint about their upcoming crime before they committed it? There are so many like errors in their story. They also blame the story that they say that Sergei Magnitsky, my dead lawyer, who was killed, by the way, for disclosing this, they say that he stole the money and he did it together with another dead guy. And the other dead guy died two months before the crime was committed. And so, these guys are like Keystone Cops when it comes to coming up with a conspiracy theory to blame the other guy.
So there have been multiple red notices placed against you. For people who don't know what a red notice is sort of a global Interpol arrest warrant or arrest directive in a sense. And there were ultimately Interpol decided, as you tell in the book, not to enforce that red notice. They decided this is politically motivated, this is bogus, and they decided not to enforce it. But there was a period of time where, as far as you knew, if you had an interaction with customs or border authorities in any number of countries, you could have been arrested and then extradited to Russia, and then who knows what would have happened. How long was that period of time where that was a concern for you, where you didn't know what would happen?
Well, so the book, I finished writing the book in 2014, and the first Interpol notice from Russia came in 2013. The second one came in 2013. And since the book was written, there have been 8 Interpol notices for my arrest from Russia. And so when you say how long, there's been numerous periods of time, a week here, 2 weeks there, 3 weeks, where if I crossed a border, I would be arrested, sent to Russia to my death. And I was arrested. In May of 2018, I was traveling to Madrid to meet with the Spanish anti-corruption prosecutor to share information about Russian money laundering connected to the murder of my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. And as I was walking out of my hotel room before my meeting with the Spanish prosecutor, 2 Spanish national policemen arrested me on a Russian Interpol warrant. And it was only because I was allowed to pack my bags in my hotel room before they took me away that I tweeted out that I was being arrested. And then all hell broke loose with journalists and activists and everybody else calling Interpol, calling the Spanish government, calling everybody else, so that by the time I got to the police station, I was released. But this kind of stuff is pretty scary, and it continues to plague me up until today. The Russians are after me. They've found me guilty twice in their courts in absentia, and have sentenced me 18 years in prison. I'd be killed if I went back there, no question.
Yeah, you know what's interesting is you talk in the book about how something that Vladimir Putin will do sometimes when he's asked about individuals that are his adversaries, and this happened with you. He won't say the person's name. And so there was a event you describe in the book where Vladimir Putin was asked about you, and he referred to you, I think, as like the gentleman you're referring to. When I was watching recently the Biden-Putin press conference that took place after their meeting, and Putin was asked about Navalny by a journalist, it was almost verbatim what was said to you. Putin didn't say his name and said something like, the person you're referring to, I believe, has committed crimes in our country, which was, I mean, that's essentially the same language you describe, is it not?
Well, he used that language about me on a number of occasions. But here's the interesting thing. So after the Magnitsky Act was passed, and just for your listeners, the Magnitsky Act is a piece of legislation named after my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who was murdered after uncovering this $230 million tax fraud that these criminals and corrupt officials committed. The Magnitsky Act was put in place in the United States and other countries, which freezes the assets and bans the visas of Russian human rights violators. Putin got so angry about the Magnitsky Act that he banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. He made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act. He even sent Natalia Veselnitskaya, a Russian lawyer, to Trump Tower to meet with Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner before Trump was elected, to say, if he's elected, please repeal the Magnitsky Act. But here's the crux. After the Magnitsky Act was passed, he got so upset with me that my name is now mentioned by Vladimir Putin. And in fact, he mentioned it very profoundly when he met with Trump, when Putin met with Trump at the Helsinki summit. And at the end of the summit, there was this question about whether whether Russia would hand over the 12 GRU officers who hacked the election. And Putin said, well, yeah, we'll hand them over if Trump hands over Bill Browder.
Bill, I so appreciate your time today. The book is Red Notice. Bill Browder is the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management and also head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. I really appreciate your time today.
My pleasure. Great to see you.